An all-out war between two modern superpowers with comparable technology, training, and military prowess is a fascinating situation. One would think that losses on both sides would be roughly equal or at least close to each other, and while service members on all sides suffered greatly during the Pacific Theater, often referred to as the meat grinder by troops on the front line, historical records show a clear disparity in casualties between the Americans and Japanese. Some estimates say that there were nearly 2 million Japanese casualties throughout the Pacific Campaign, while the American casualty estimates were a total of about 350,000 killed or wounded. This puts the Japanese casualty rate at nearly 6 times that of the Americans. Considering the Japanese were fighting closer to their homes and in positions that were oftentimes heavily fortified against amphibious assaults, one is left wondering, why did the Japanese lose so much more than the attacking Americans and their allies? Did the Americans use better tactics? Did the Japanese have inferior weaponry and equipment? Or was it some combination of several factors? Before we dive into any tactics used by either side of the Pacific conflict, we need to take stock of the fighting capabilities of the Japanese and Americans at the start of World War II. Japan formally joined the Axis powers in 1940 in an effort to bolster its ability to expand the Japanese empire. At this time, Japan was considered to be the most industrialized country in Asia. This industrialization combined with strong imperialistic ambition motivated the Japanese to develop some finely crafted military armaments. Even still, one of the most commonly noted disadvantages of the Japanese was that the Japanese soldier was equipped with an older bolt-action Arisaka rifle. Bolt-action rifles weren't necessarily out of date during the outbreak of World War II. However, by the time America was pulled into the war, the semi-automatic M1 Garand was rapidly becoming the standard issue weapon for American troops. There was a pretty clear advantage in having a simple and well-designed semi-automatic rifle. Having a semi-automatic rifle obviously increased the rate of fire for U.S. troops, but more importantly, it allowed the Americans to keep their rifles trained on a target between follow-on shots, whereas a Japanese rifleman would have to rack the bolt of the rifle and reposition their sights between every shot. Taking control of the Pacific Islands often came down to U.S. riflemen slowly gaining ground in smaller-scale firefights with entrenched Japanese positions. The increased rate of fire played a significant role in how Americans were able to win many of these engagements. Add in the slightly larger capacity of the M1 Garand clip over that of the Arisaka, and it becomes clear how a United States infantryman would feel more confident going into a small-scale firefight.
The U.S. rifle caliber .30 M1, commonly known as the Garand, is not only a dependable weapon, it also has a terrific wallop, better known as firepower. In fact, one man firing a Garand can do nearly as much damage as 3 men using the old-type Springfield rifle with its hand-operated bolt.
However, it should be noted that the majority of casualties in World War II were actually caused by artillery bombardments, air raids, and automatic machine gun fire. It is often said that the real purpose of small arms fire during the war was to keep enemies locked in position so they could be accurately targeted by mortars and offshore naval bombardments. When it comes to discussing the navies of the Pacific War, one could argue that Japan actually had a stronger navy at the start of the war. In 1941 and 1942, the Japanese fleet had more aircraft carriers than the American Navy. The aircraft carrier would prove to be the most important ship of the war and would overtake the standard battleship as the core strength of any navy.
Carrier has arrived.
So how did a country with a larger naval force lose an amphibious campaign? The Japanese Navy began to lose its dominance of the Pacific at the Battle of Midway in 1942. In this battle, Japan lost all 4 of the aircraft carriers that committed to the operation, while the United States lost only 1. In fact, during the Battle of Midway, the United States was able to sink 3 of Japan's aircraft carriers in the span of just 5 minutes. This can be attributed to the stellar job of American naval intelligence. The Japanese had robust plans for attacking Midway Atoll, occupying the territory, and then ambushing American aircraft carriers that would be sent to push back the Japanese occupation. The American Navy caught wind of this plan ahead of time and brought as much air power as it could to the region in order to set up a counter-ambush before the Japanese plot could be put fully into motion. The USS Yorktown was expected to be too heavily damaged to join the battle, which bolstered the confidence of the Japanese. However, in an effort to bring as much firepower to the fight as possible, repairs on the Yorktown were expedited and it was made battle-ready in a matter of a few days. This American ability to replenish naval forces at an extreme speed would also play a critical role in American success in the Pacific, but we'll come back to that. The Battle of Midway kicked off in 1942 when American aircraft spotted part of the Japanese invasion force on its way to Midway Atoll. This allowed American defenses to prepare for the attack, and the Americans were able to keep close tabs on the position of the Japanese fleet. With this reconnaissance information, American bombing crews were quickly dispatched to intercept the Japanese. These bombing crews fought tooth and nail to try and get direct hits on the crucial Japanese aircraft carriers. 41 American Devastator bombers were dispatched to attack the incoming Japanese fleet. Of these 41 bombers, only 6 would return safely. These bombers would not be destroyed in vain. Their sacrifice paved the way for a follow-up attack by a combination of more bombers with fighter plane escorts. This bombing run would end up being one of the most important and decisive moments in the entire World War. 3 of Japan's aircraft carriers were destroyed within 5 minutes of each other, with a 4th carrier being destroyed the following day. The losses incurred by the Japanese during the Battle of Midway leveled the playing field and allowed the U.S. Navy to go on the offensive in the Pacific. With more aggressive naval support, America had a much easier time bombarding the Pacific Islands that housed the entrenched Japanese forces. The Battle of Midway wasn't solely responsible for the American naval dominance in the Pacific. At the time of the war, America also had a much greater industrial capacity that allowed the Americans to replenish their losses and overtake the Japanese as a naval power. The Japanese may have started the war with more active aircraft carriers, but by 1943, the U.S. Navy had more than twice as many carriers in service.
Carrier has arrived.
These aircraft carriers would prove to be vital in transporting aircraft that could provide fire support and reconnaissance for the ground forces on the Pacific Islands. The success of the U.S. Navy would prove to be a key reason why the Japanese losses were so disproportionate during the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific Theater. So far, we've talked about the difference in equipment used by both sides of the war in the Pacific, as well as the difference in naval power. A crucial component as to why Japanese casualties were so extreme, however, is more related to the mindset of the Japanese during World War II. The Senjin-kun, or Instruction for the Battlefield, was a small codebook issued to Japanese soldiers. In this codebook, retreat or surrender was specifically forbidden. The quote from the book, "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner," was drilled into Japanese infantrymen on a daily basis. What's even more terrifying is that this codebook was even distributed to Japanese civilians near the end of the war in preparation for the Allied invasion of the Japanese mainland.
Another group of Japanese schoolgirls are put through bayonet drill and rifle practice under the eye of an army officer. Although it is doubtful whether these maidens will ever see combat, they undergo part of the same stern training their young brothers receive in preparation for induction into Japan's conscript army.
During World War II, Emperor Hirohito was seen as a divine being, not necessarily a god, but definitely a sort of link between the Japanese people and the spiritual realm. This way of thinking was brought about during the Showa Restoration, a movement in the 1930s that sought to restore power directly to the emperor. It might be hard to believe that an industrialized country of the 20th century could have a leader that was thought to be a literal divine being, but this reverence of the emperor was so pervasive that in 1946, Emperor Hirohito himself was forced by the Allied powers to create an official government document denying the idea that he was descended from the gods. This document was called the Humanity Declaration and would be one of the last acts of Hirohito as the sovereign leader of Japan. Clearly, this discipline and devotion to the Japanese emperor was a leading contributor to the high casualty rate of Japanese soldiers. It was seen as an honor to give your life for the emperor of Japan, and this mindset spread from the enlisted infantry all the way up to the senior officers. Many Japanese officers would be willing to sacrifice their men in an effort to win battles. The Japanese believed that the war would be won by the side with the most fearless soldiers. During the beginning of the war, Japanese would willingly engage their enemy despite being heavily outnumbered. This is in stark contrast to the more Western doctrine of war that gives much more consideration to the concept of unacceptable losses. The United States forces were much more likely to simply avoid engagements where they would be at a disadvantage.
We just cracked a whole regiment of Germans. We got a mopping up job to do. It's a pleasure, and you jerk, you're playing with suicide. Now, I might get killed out here, but I'll be damned if it's going to be on account of your curiosity.
By the end of the war, the Japanese did start to be more thoughtful about how they engaged their enemy. One of the reasons why Okinawa proved to be so miserable for the Americans is because of how deep the Japanese retreated into the core of the island, where they would have better cover and better ambush positions. The Japanese mindset of death before surrender absolutely resulted in extreme casualties for the Japanese. One could argue that it was the key reason why Japan lost so many more troops than the attacking United States. But there is one final factor that may have actually played a larger role in the deaths of Japanese troops. Starvation and sickness were rampant amongst the Japanese army. There were many periods of the war where Japan simply did not have the logistical capacity to accomplish all of its goals. Both sides had to face the nightmare of bringing supplies to isolated islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. With every victory, however, the United States gained more control of sea lanes and air bases that were essential to the logistical process of occupying a foreign land. A perfect depiction of this can be seen with Guadalcanal in 1942. Allied forces made it a priority to establish an operational airbase on the island itself right after the initial landing. In contrast, the closest Japanese base was over 600 miles away. To make things worse, the Japanese had spread themselves impossibly thin. Much of Japan's aerial resources were needed in China and Southeast Asia. To make things worse, the resources that could be given to the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were lost before they could reach their destination. Cargo ships were easily sunk by American aircraft stationed on the island. Yoshida Yutaka, a professor at a Japanese university, has said the loss of control of the air on the South Pacific Front, combined with a lack of long-term strategic planning on the part of the Japanese military command, left deployed forces constantly under the threat of starvation. The Japanese tried a variety of strategies to bring more food and medical supplies to Guadalcanal. The so-called drum method was attempted, in which barrels of supplies were tied together and dumped into the ocean. Nearby smaller boats that were harder for American planes to spot would then try to drag the drums ashore. The violent surface action of the water near Guadalcanal, however, made this too difficult, and of the 200 drums that were initially dropped off, none made it to the weary Japanese soldiers. This method was attempted again a few days later with slightly more success. In total, 1,700 supply drums were dropped into the ocean, and only 310 of them reached their destination. A poem written by Kashichi Yoshida, a non-commissioned officer in the Japanese army, details the conditions the Japanese had to endure on Guadalcanal. No matter how far we walk, we don't know where we're going, trudging along under dark jungle growth. When will this march end? Hide during the day, move at night, deep in the lush Guadalcanal jungle. Our rice is gone, eating roots and grass, along the ridges and cliffs. Leaves hide the trail, we lose our way. Stumble and get up, fall and get up. Covered with mud from our falls, blood oozes from our wounds, no cloth to bind our cuts. Flies swarm to the scabs, no strength to brush them away. Fall down and cannot move. How many times I've thought of suicide. The situation got so bad, in fact, that General Hitoshi Imamura began embellishing the number of troops garrisoned on Guadalcanal in an effort to give logistical priority to his men. In total, 31,000 Japanese men were actually stationed on Guadalcanal. Of this number, over 20,000 died of starvation, disease, or combat, or were listed as missing in action. In contrast, 1,600 American losses were recorded on the island. Guadalcanal serves as a great microcosm that depicts the disparity of losses between the Japanese and U.S. forces. In total, the Japanese lost over 2.5 million troops throughout the duration of the Pacific Theater, with a little over half of these deaths being attributed to disease and starvation. For comparison, the United States is recorded as having a total casualty count of 350,000 during the campaign. Historians have gone to great lengths to identify the cause of the vastly different number of losses between the Japanese and Americans. We can conclude by saying the extreme losses of the Japanese were due to a combination of factors. These include a lack of logistical planning, an overconfidence in and mismanagement of the Navy, and a devout mindset to avoid surrender or capture at all costs. Of course, this is not to take away from the immense sacrifice made by the U.S. forces. The Pacific Theater was one of the harshest environments one could fight in, with a casualty rate nearly 5 times higher than in Europe. Popular media does an incredible job of depicting the horrors that all parties had to experience during the island-hopping campaign. Through a combination of naval superiority and logistical dominance, the Americans were able to emerge as the victors, while the Japanese had to face the harsh reality of losing their crucial foothold in the Pacific Ocean. Perhaps most importantly, the Pacific Theater also forced the Japanese to reconsider their approach to warfare and devotion to their leaders as a whole. We hope you found this video informative as well as entertaining. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. If there were any inaccuracies you noticed, don't hesitate to leave a comment with corrections.